Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 11th part in our series, Rome, the Decline of Democracy. Where we last left off, the Emperor Trajan had just finished his rule as one of Rome's best emperors, making peace with the Senate, conquering new territories, and overall increasing Rome's prosperity during the era of Pax Romana. Brett, welcome back to the show. What great emperor lays waiting in the shadows for us next?
Last time we spoke, we ended with Trajan and his death and the rise of his protege Hadrian, who is sometimes referred to as the Greekling because of his love of Greek culture. He was there's some interesting stuff with him. Potentially, he was not picked by Trajan himself, but rather Trajan's wife, who favored the young boy and really wanted him to be the emperor, and she kind of like orchestrated his crowning. There's some validity to that theory. So Hadrian would be next as the Greekling, but I think we're going to skip over Hadrian. We're going to go a couple of emperors down the line and wind up at Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. As a quick background, Hadrian is going to meet the young Marcus Aurelius when he's like a child, because he is the grandson of a close friend of his. And for whatever reason, he's gonna like love this kid. And
I guess first impressions are everything.
yeah. He clearly saw something. Excuse me. He clearly saw something in this boy, and he has the boy kind of like set upon this path of like the political ladder, so to speak. He has him entered into several like clubs, cults, whatever you want to call them, that he's too young to get into, or he doesn't technically qualify for, but he's the emperor, so he has it done anyway. And people are kind of like, I mean, like even we are kind of already seeing the writing on the wall. So he's entering he's not technically in the cursus honorum. The cursus honorum is like the set stages that a man would take to kind of like rise through the ranks of Roman politics. But he's starting at a really, really young age, before he's even 10 years old. It's interesting because he's too young to be the emperor, right? He's By the time that he's like 15, he's going to be wed to the daughter of a man named Lucius, who's currently the Hadrian's choice for emperor, right? This man is constantly on death's door. That's his only notable thing, is that he's always near death. Hadrian, I mean, not to editorialize too much, but Hadrian clearly had a plan of having this constantly near dead guy be the emperor for like a couple of years and then dropping dead and then having Marcus take over.
Sort of like a custodian that can just watch over things until Aurelius is old enough to actually take over.
Absolutely. That was absolutely the plan, was to have Lucius be emperor for maybe, let's say, 5 to 10 years and then die, right? The problem is that the plan works too well. And Lucius dies before Hadrian dies, and thus he can't the whole order of operations is thrown out of whack, right? He did too good a job of picking a sickly person. So instead, Hadrian picks another man named Antonius Pius, on the condition that Antonius Pius adopts Marcus and, for some reason, Lucius's biological son, a man that we'll know as Lucius Verus in the near future, right? We'll just call him Lucius for now. It's worth noting that Marcus doesn't really like Hadrian. Actually, no, let's start with this. Marcus, his family comes from the Iberian Peninsula, just like Hadrian and just like Trajan. Spain is like a fairly new addition to Rome, and it's pumping out really strong leadership right now. So he's like the heir of like a brick manufacturing company. Company is not really a thing yet, but you can think of it like that, a business, right? And he's already very reserved, very quiet. He's homeschooled. Roman public education, if you think American public education is bad, you should see what public education looked like in Rome in the, like the mid 100s AD. It's pretty awful. It's awful for all the reasons that we say American education is awful too, which is funny, is like they never learn to think for themselves. They just learn to like repeat arithmetic problems, repeat the answers without ever even learning how to find the answers. They just say like, like 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 4, 4 + 4 is 8. But if you were like, what's 4 + 2, they wouldn't know the answer because it's not one of the ones that they memorized, right?
So a lot of rote learning going on over there.
It's all rote learning. And they learn or learned, I don't want to say learn because there's not too many Roman schools anymore, but they learned how to like write out the scripts from like famous orations before they learned the alphabet. So they were writing scripts to things that they couldn't even themselves read.
That's interesting. That kind of reminds me of even China. To like pass their civil service exam, you had to be able to verbatim write like, Confucius and then later Neo-Confucian texts. And people would actually say, well, are you just memorizing this so you can get your civil service job, or do you actually understand the wisdom that's like embedded into this text? And like, I think that's a danger that goes on today. I think when you have like an overly testing culture, one has to scratch their head like, okay, it seems like you've done a good job memorizing this. Are you really going to remember it 3 years from now?
Aaron, I'm going to tell you a secret. When I got bar mitzvahed and I had to recite part of the Torah in Hebrew, I only learned phonetically how to speak it and never learned what I was saying. I just memorized the phonetic pronunciation of everything and said that. So I know for a fact that this still goes on today.
Sure, right. You got further in Hebrew school. I dropped out of Hebrew school, so you did a lot better than me.
Well, well, that aside, so Marcus was never. So one thing is that it seems like Roman public schools really like beats the life out of Roman children, right? And Marcus considers it one of the best things to ever happen to him that he was homeschooled, right?
Mm-hmm.
He learned from some of the greatest philosophers of his day at home, right? Which is obviously not something that everyone can do, but when you're super rich and your dad's BFFs with the emperor, that kind of stuff can happen.
So he gets like a Alexander the Great kind of tutoring from like almost like Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. So like he's getting Aurelius is getting a premium like philosopher education here.
Yes, for sure. Because I mean, a lot of the emperors get this. This is a rich person thing at this time to be homeschooled by like Greek slaves. And I think we spoke in the past about how slavery in the Roman Empire was not always equal. There were slaves that we would recognize today as like middle class workers, right?
Now, this is something I really just want to touch upon really strongly here. As you know, Brett, this is a philosophy podcast, and
I did know that. Yeah.
and what's very interesting, I love the way that you just described the Roman education system, where the masses are pretty much taught like rote learning techniques, right? Like, okay, here's what you're going to need to do X, Y, and Z, right? And I noticed that there's this pattern of like elites or people in power really getting a really hardcore philosophical education. And I think a lot of the reasoning behind that is that, oh, well, you're so-and-so's son. Eventually, you're going to be in a position of power where you're going to need to make a lot of executive decisions. And I do to some degree see that even happening in America, where if you talk to the average, become a nurse, become a become a PA. Like we go for these very practical careers, and something like philosophy is not really as like advertised, I would say, for the working class as much, because it's almost presumed that you're not going to ever be working in a position of like high executive functioning. And I kind of see that going on in Rome the same exact thing going on here. Like, it's not like a plebeian doesn't really need to know what Aristotle said. They just need to know how to make that bowl really, really, really nice. And I think there is kind of this two-tier educational system that kind of goes on today.
Well, so I would agree. It's a little bit of like a chicken and the egg kind of situation where, on the one hand, there's a lot of factors. So on the one hand, one factor is just resources.
Yeah.
The rich can afford to pay for better education. In our day, this is less and less true. You can't buy your way into truly great higher education. You have to earn it. And on the flip side, if you are truly gifted in the United States anyway, you have a decent chance of getting to learn and grow, right? Like I'm not going to sit here and tell you that our education system is perfect, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we all have an equal shot at being, like, successful via schooling, because that's obviously not true. But I will say that we're a lot, I guess this is almost like a non-saying, but we're a lot closer than we were 2,000 years ago.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. I mean,
so, but back then, much more, if you wanted a good education, you needed the money. You could be a genius, but it literally would not matter at all. You can't afford those private tutors, then you're not getting educated. It's going to go to waste, right? So that's one factor. Another factor is this idea that what they learned, what, like, Marcus Aurelius, let's take him for example, what he's learning is how to be a good leader. He's learning how to make deals. He's learning how to be I said it. He's learning how to be a leader, a competent and effective leader. And would it really help the son of, like, a poor pottery maker to learn how to be an effective leader?
Right? I hear you on both fronts, but I think that I can't take the values of America and like throw them back 2,000 years. So, like, it's a very tough case. But I would say, at least in America, I would say yes. Like, even if your parents are poor, I still think that you should have exposure to that realm of thinking, because I think what it does is that it actually, one, gives you a great deal of confidence, but it also gives you the ability to think critically and independently. I think if you don't have a strong philosophy, I'm obviously biased because I run a philosophy podcast, but I think that if you don't have great exposure to philosophy, it kind of limits your ability to really think independently.
Well, part of it is that from our perspective, it's like, this is like a common fault that people will fall into, is you're thinking like, well, you might as well learn philosophy, like, like these kids today, they're watching TV, they're playing video games, they should be thinking critically. But back then, time spent in school is time not spent tending the farm,
Sure,
herding the sheep, making the pots. This is money on the table. This is food out of the mouths of these families. And there's a real trade-off. This is not a matter of like, oh, this dullard doesn't even think critically. He's couldn't even write an essay on Aristotle. It's like, they need the time to make the money to eat, or they'll starve.
Oh, I'll give you a little sneak preview of what Aurelius would say. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. So even if you're not necessarily using that executive decision making or that philosophy to, like, be a power wielder or a king point, or to appoint kings, just having a better sense of thought can actually allow you to negotiate the drudgery of farming, or the drudgery of when there's not enough food to eat, or how to even properly save for the future. Like, okay, we're not going to like overindulge on Tuesday so that we have enough food for Wednesday. So I would argue that, like, even if you're not going to be emperor of Rome, having some philosophy even in your day-to-day life can actually make a significant difference.
I would agree. I don't think any amount of philosophy is going to save you from not having enough food to eat, though. I struggle to see where that will help. But no, you're correct. So it's a combination of, one, the rich can afford better education. Two, the better education is better suited for the lifestyles of the rich. It's less useful for the poor. As you said, not totally useless, but it's just less useful. And time is important. They don't have all day. There's work to be done. They don't have all night. Rome is a famously dark city at night. Rome, like most of the ancient world, would just shut down when the sun goes down. So there you are. Your time is very valuable in the ancient world, and you gotta learn what you need. And the truth is that even regular school they didn't need what they were learning. Even the stuff you're talking about, like philosophy of like the philosophy that would improve their lives, for the most part, is taught by the parents. Roman school was more almost like it was more like history. And the last thing is that the early era of this, the Romans just like, even if you take away the, oh, only the rich can afford it, oh, only the rich need it, it's just they were new at this. Public education was a fairly new thing, and they were doing the best they could. They didn't know yet what was important, what would matter. So Marcus Aurelius is getting tutored privately. While he's being tutored privately, in his mid-20s, he's gonna pick up this growing trend in Roman philosophical society called Stoicism.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to be taught by a man named Rusticus, whose name should sound at least kind of familiar. And Rusticus is going to teach him everything he knows about what it is to be a Stoic. The quote that you just said, it comes from his Stoic background, right?
Yeah.
It really spoke to him, and it shouldn't come as a surprise why, given what we know about him and how meticulous he was and how generous he was, and he was not self-centered and very duty-bound and duty-driven, and because of this,
Mm-hmm.
like Stoicism fits him like a glove, right? He is it helps. If anything, Stoicism is going to help Marcus deal with being the emperor, because he, from what we can tell, is not super thrilled about being the emperor in the first place, right? He wants to just read all day and think. He has duties to perform, right? He has roles to fill, and that's what Stoicism is about. Stoicism is about doing your duty and performing the roles that you're supposed to perform. And so I think in a way that helped him. It helped him shoulder that burden.
I think that not all philosophies are created equal. So if you are, for example, a hedonist, I don't think that's a good philosophy to adapt if you're going to be a Roman emperor. The philosophy that you carry with you, they're not all created equal. But I think that Stoicism, if you're going to take a job that is pretty much dedicated to public service, I can't think of a better philosophy.
No, I would agree with you. The public servants should be stoic. They should be duty bound, and their number one priority is serving the people, right? Although it's a little bit, it's confusing with Rome, because it's like, are they public servants?
They
like
should be.
they're kings. They're kings, right? Are kings public servants, or are servants publics of, or is the public servants of the king? Right. It depends where
Ideally,
you are.
well, if you ask Plato, ideally they should be philosopher kings, but we can get into that another time.
Right. So Marcus is going to get, when his adopted father, Antonius Pius, dies. Antonius Pius was a decent ruler. We could touch briefly on what he was doing. He kicks a lot of cans down the road for his children to deal with, and for the future people of Rome to deal with. Inflation is starting to become an issue that he kind of ignores. There's a brewing war with the Parthians and King Vologases the fourth that is kind of starting up, that he's ignoring. That's going to be a problem. There's problems on the Danube frontier. That's going to be a problem that he's just ignoring with the Germanic tribes. But during his reign, none of these things boil over, so he generally gets the pass, for better or for worse.
Right, not under my watch.
No, exactly. So when he finally dies, he leaves the emperorship. That's not what it's called, but he leaves control of Rome to his son, Marcus Aurelius, right? Marcus Aurelius, for whatever reason that we don't know, we still don't know, demands from the Senate, because remember that there's still like this charade of democracy going on, even now, even in 100 years after, more than 100 years, even like 150 years after Augustus Caesar has taken control of Rome, there's still this charade of democracy, right? And the Senate is the body that confers authority onto the emperor. They're the ones that are like, okay, we give you all these titles, we give you these positions, we give you these powers. It's all very orchestrated, and no one's under any kind of illusion, but it's good for public perception, right? And
To the surprise of everyone, Marcus appoints, or Marcus demands from the Senate that they also elevate his half brother Lucius Verus to the rank of emperor. And this is, at the time, this is pretty unheard of. It shocks people. Who would want to share power like this? It's crazy. Rome has never had an official dual power sharing thing up until this point. There's some kind of power sharing going on in Rome with Augustus Caesar and his second in command, Agrippa, but it wasn't like official. And in actuality, what ends up happening with Marcus and Lucius is very similar, where Marcus is like the top, and Lucius is like his second in command, right? Rome, in like 150 years, this will be the norm, having multiple emperors, right? Rome is fast becoming too large for one person to govern, and maybe Marcus saw that, or maybe it was through some kind of like stoic desire to fulfill the wishes of the person before him.
Well, I think, I might venture a guess here is that if he thought that his right to be emperor was going to be challenged, he might have just made a preemptive move and been like, well, we could have this guy preemptively challenge me to be emperor, or I could just right off the bat make a concession to him right here. And I've already done him a solid. And if you do someone a solid and you already put them in power, even if it's just a perfunctionary role of just like, okay, I'm going to make you co-emperor, you've kind of stroked their ego a little bit and you've made a potential enemy into a friend.
So when Emperor Diocletian forms the Tetrarchy, he does just that, right? So it's interesting that you say that. It's very heads up. You're not in bad company thinking that. Lucius and Marcus had, as far as anyone can tell, a good relationship, and Antony, whatever plans Hadrian had for Lucius died with his death, because Antonius Pius could not care less about Lucius. Even though Lucius got the same education and the same advantages that Marcus got, Marcus was always the main son. Part of what they do to kind of show you as going to be the next emperor is they make you, the current emperor will make you a consul, right? And there's I won't get too deep into it, but let's just say there's different levels of being a consul depending on the year that you're made a consul, and whether you're the first consul or the second consul for the year, right? And Marcus always got the good version and Lucius always got the bad version. I mean, that is to say, the bad version of being the president is not necessarily bad, but it's certainly worse than I don't know, I'm trying to think of a
sort of like a informal VP kind of position there.
Yeah, you could, that's fair. Imagine if your father made you the president and your brother the vice president. Being the vice president is no slouch. No one is going to laugh at you for being the vice president, but at the same time it's pretty clear who your dad wants to lead the country when he's gone, right? Like that, right? Lucius was always overlooked as a kid and as a young adult, whereas they each kind of had their own coping mechanisms for being in positions of such authority. But Lucius, authority is not the right word, actually, it's power, because Lucius did not have authority. Marcus had authority even at a young age because he was being groomed to be the consul and the emperor, and Lucius just straight up was not. So while Marcus was kind of putting duty first so he could one day be an effective ruler. Lucius was falling in with a crowd of gamblers and prostitutes and actors, those filthy bunch. And funny anecdote, in Rome, an actor was considered to be like of lower social standing than like a prostitute.
Okay.
Like you would be more looked down upon if you were an actor than if you were a literal prostitute in Rome.
My oh my, how things have changed.
How things have changed, exactly. Like it was jumping forward like a little bit when Emperor Justinian took the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire. His wife Theodora was an actress, and it was this huge scandal. They like could not believe it, right? It was crazy. Anyway, that's going way off topic. So Lucius is kind of becoming more hedonistic, like you said. You know, it's funny that you mention it. His brother is becoming more hedonistic as Marcus becomes more stoic. And my point that I'm making here is that I don't think Lucius ever really wanted to rule, right? He was happy supporting the green faction of the chariot races. Yeah, funny story. Rome had sports teams.
So there's a really good quote here from Meditations that might actually explain Aurelius's thinking on this subject, and that is,
Okay.
how much time he gains who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks, but only at what he does himself to make it just and holy. And I think Aurelius's plan here is to be like, I don't really care, as long as this guy is not harming the empire, I don't really care what it is that he's doing. And I think there's a good lesson that can kind of be taken here, because oftentimes in life, we concern ourselves with other people and what they're doing, even if it doesn't directly affect us. Okay. Like obviously, if you have a boss or a coworker that's preventing you from doing something, you got to take action. But if Aurelius is smart enough to kind of distract his brother and get him just like, oh, yeah, have fun at the horse races, my friend. That's a classic Stoic move there, where you're not really even paying any attention to anybody who's distracting you in any such way. And as long as they're of no harm, you're immediately just pursuing what you believe to be virtuous. Whereas I think someone who may not be steeped in Stoicism as much might get a little too caught up, like, hey man, you're making the empire looking bad here, and that could have caused like a friction. But I think that's a Stoic move right there, to just worry about yourself as long as that other person is not interfering with your happiness.
Oh, absolutely. And it's definitely editorializing to say this, but I often wonder what their personal relationship was. They clearly were close enough that Marcus trusted him to be second in command when he had no pressure to do so. And even though they were very distinctly opposites, a Stoic and a hedonist, there were no major issues, and they did things in unison. When they were made co-emperors, the first thing they did is they went to the Praetorian guard camp and bribed the guards, which sounds seedy, but I assure you it's what all the emperors did at the time to ensure that the military and the police essentially in Rome were loyal to you. But the point is that they did it together. They went down together and did it, right, as a joint show of force, which is kind of a big deal. There's not much record of them kind of like disagreeing and doing things opposite. When Marcus told Lucius to like sober up and get his shit together and do something, Lucius would do it for the most part. And when Lucius was like, hey, I think we should have these really crazy games and put on some fun for all the people of Rome, Marcus would begrudgingly be like, okay, fine, let's do it.
And this brings me to another quote from Meditations. Waste no time arguing about what a good man should be one. So I think Aurelius is just immediately thinking to himself, okay, this is a lost cause right here. Have fun. I will. Sure, my friend. I'll be at that party. Oh, it's 9:30. It's rather late. I got to go. So like, I think that he has this way of just fundamentally understanding fundamental sense that you can't really change people's nature, but you can kind of humor their nature in a way that makes it benign.
One thing to keep in mind here is that he's not just brushing off Lucius, because if he was, he wouldn't have made him emperor in the first place.
But he's doing, see, the thing is that he's giving him what he thinks that he wants. Like Lucius thinks, oh, I want to be emperor. So Aurelius is saying to himself, absolutely, my friend, you, my friend, are just as powerful as I am. Absolutely. But in reality, he's secretly undermining, like he's secretly taking his power away by just being like, oh, my friend Lucius, you don't want to deal with that road project over there. You're gonna be up all night worrying about that. Tell you what, my friend, I'll take that off your plate, my friend, so you can go have fun with your prostitutes later. So he's giving him the power of emperor and letting him have fun and feel like a big boy, but in reality he's quietly stealing things off his plate and he doesn't even see it happening.
It's possible. I would disagree though, if only because Marcus didn't need to do that. He could have just. There's no evidence that Lucius wanted to be emperor or had any machinations to be emperor. And then when Marcus names him emperor, he didn't have to do that. He could have, if he wanted Lucius's authority, he could have just not named him emperor and just did everything himself. He wanted something. He wanted him to be emperor for some reason.
I kind of see it as like balancing the Senate. It's like you want these people to be happy. And it doesn't, and you can make them happy without necessarily giving them power. But if you give them the illusion of feeling powerful, they're going to be plenty happy. So again, like I said, I see some stratagem here.
But Lucius was already happy. He was already doing what he wanted to do. But it could be. I think that regardless, the result is that a fairly surprised Lucius and a fairly confident Marcus ascend the throne and become the empire's first official co-emperors. Their reign is pretty hectic. Like within very short time of their father Antonius Pius dying, Vologases IV kind of like makes the move to conquer Armenia. Armenia is like a major player in this region, in this time period. It acts as an important buffer state between Rome and then whatever empire is currently running things in the east, whether that be the Seleucids or the Parthians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or whoever. There's lots of different kingdoms kind of rise and fall in that area. But Armenia is really important. They're the buffer state. And we constantly see Rome and we'll just call them the East fighting over it. Vologases IV kind of invades Armenia, deposes the pro-Roman king, puts up a pro-Parthian king, essentially daring these young emperors to do something about it. So Marcus sends Lucius. He says, Lucius, please go take care of this. And Lucius shrugs his shoulders and is like, fine. if you insist, older brother. And off he goes, right? Lucius parties the entire way out there, making numerous stops, taking his time, lots of celebrations in every Greek city on the way out east, right? He does eventually arrive. When he arrives, and here's the important thing, here's what separates Lucius from Nero or Lucius from Caligula, right? When Lucius arrives, his friends, his drinking buddies, his gambling buddies, his chariot racing buddies, or I guess you would call them his sports buddies, the prostitutes, the actors, the actresses, the whatever, he dismisses them momentarily. Mm-hmm. He's like, guys, could you just give me a minute here? And then he goes, who here knows what they're doing? And then some Roman field commanders like raise their hand tentatively. And they're like, I've been in charge here for like 10 years on the frontier. And he's like, great. What are we supposed to be doing right now? And they tell him the strategy. And he's like, great, go do that. And then he goes back to his gambling and his right. And if that was Caligula or that was Nero, they would have appointed their friends as the new field commanders.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
They would be like, you're not in control of the army anymore. My friend is. He's going to do a great job. I've known him since college. We used to call him, Turd Sandwich when we were a frat together. He's going to do great, right? Cronyism. Cronyism is the name of the game, and it really, to me, is a powerful message that the person at the top could be completely ineffectual and completely disinterested, but as long as you don't have nepotism or cronyism in play, things work out all right, right? The system works relatively normally as long as it's only like one or two people at the top who are dicking around.
I completely agree with that analysis. And it's like, I think what this comes down to is like, if you're a knucklehead, that's fine, but just realize that you're a knucklehead, and I think that the ego sometimes overtakes people. And I give Lucius a lot of credit for at least realizing, hey, me and my friends are too dumb to really do anything right here. Let the experts take over. I mean,
yeah. And that's what he does. And it's pretty effective. The Parthian War goes well, and Lucius does pretty well. He comes back with a name so long, so many titles. He comes back as, because obviously, even though his subordinates are the ones winning the wars, as is even in the modern day, he is taking all the credit. He comes back. His name is Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus Armenicus Parthicus Maximus Mediacus. That's a lot of titles, right?
I'm wondering, I'm thinking like a lot of Roman conflicts could have been brought to an end with a bunch of alcohol, prostitutes, and some long names, right? Like, I think that's what everyone was really looking for all along.
You don't get a name like this without making some serious moves, Aaron. Okay. But yeah, so he does pretty well. Marcus, he comes back and celebrates a triumph, which, as we kind of discussed in the past, is like a military parade. And even Marcus shows up to join in the festivities, something he normally doesn't like to do. But Big Brother is proud of the accomplishments that they did, and he should be. This is a brief moment of success towards the end of this era for Rome. You have a little war that goes well for the Romans. They get a little bit of territory. They depose some kings. They make some money. Good all around.
And I think that's another part on Aurelius is that this is truly mastery of the ego, where it's like he's so duty bound that he's going to show up to his younger brother's victory, and he's not going to be like, man, I'm not there in the spotlight or whatever. He's kind of able to just step aside, and that again is an idea of stoicism, where you're taking your ego and just really suppressing it, so it's like you almost are a non-existent being, and that allows you to actually execute your duty in a way that's much more faithful than if you're an ego first person.
And he does that. He's very reserved, very duty bound, but he's certainly willing when it is required of him to not be that.
Okay.
This war will have lasting consequences for Rome and the world around it, as the way that Parthia and whatever kingdom is in control of this region at this time makes money is by taxing and regulating trade economy across the Silk Road being the main trade route from the Han Dynasty in China out to the west. And they will bring back with them a plague, what we today know as smallpox, what they call the Antonine Plague, and it's going to devastate Rome. And one of the effects of this devastation is going to be a loosening of the grip, as it were, on the Germanic tribes north of the east, right, on the Danube and the Rhine. And because of this, lots of wars are going to break out in this area. And Marcus, who was never a military man, is going to have to learn very quickly how to be a general and how to lead troops. And like you said, it's not because he wants to. He would prefer to be home reading philosophy books. He does it because it's his duty, because he has to. It's what's asked of him. And for now, they're riding high. They're pretty happy. Fast forward a little bit, and the plague is kind of taking. So there's two things at play here. Thing number one is that to have enough soldiers for this war with the Parthians, they had to take troops off the frontier, the Germanic frontier. And the Germans kind of realized this. They're like, hey, the lights are on. And the Germans kind of realize this. They're like, hey, the lights are on, but I don't think anyone's home. And they start getting braver. One thing about this is worth getting into, I think, which is when we think of Rome and we think of like we romanticize that period, we think of Rome as like the super advanced civilization surrounded by these dirt farming, pig whatevering, savages. But that's not totally the case. And then the other question is, why do you think that Rome was so advanced and these other places weren't? Were the Italians just like genetically better and it enabled them to be so much smarter? The answer is no, is that Rome wages different kinds of war, economic, psychological, political, social war, to suppress the tribes and keep them small and keep them bickering so that they can never kind of consolidate and rise up and be a threat to Roman hegemony. Rome focuses its attention on keeping these tribes weak so that they do not have to fight them in wars.
It's a classic divide and conquer strategy.
Absolutely, Aaron. That's what they're doing. It's a divide and conquer strategy, and it's incredibly effective. And the problem is that starting with Antonius Pius and now with Lucius taking troops off this border, the Germans are more and more being left to their own devices. And when left to their own devices, they're seeing they have more in common than not. And they're starting to unify a little bit. They're starting to talk about joining their armies together to attack Rome. Not necessarily to invade it, but to like steal from them. Yeah, Rome's attitude towards its border states is always one of control and controlled trade. They want to make sure they're always getting the better deal. The Roman walls at this time are not like what you would consider to be like the Great Wall of China, like just like a giant wall that people are kept out of. And if you get too close to the wall, someone dumps rocks on your head until you leave. They're more like trading posts. The walls are there to force people coming into the state of Rome to kind of like funnel into one location so they can be questioned and taxed and evaluated and assessed.
It's like pretty much a border.
It is a border. It is a modern day, ancient version of a modern day border, right?
Yeah.
So Romans is definitely doing that, and when they have to take attention away from those states to do other stuff like fight the Parthians and deal with a plague, then those conditions get relaxed and the Germans coalesce into a stronger fighting force. This is around the time that the German people start to become an issue for Rome.
And, I think this is one of the consequences of just, as your empire gets larger, everything is just going to be stretched that much thinner. And if your troops are already stretched thin already, one little crisis can kind of just send you over the edge.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's happening here.
Yeah.
Is that they don't have the bandwidth to deal with this. Because the Antonine Plague starts with the soldiers, it hits the soldiers and the military the hardest. So when the Germans are attacking on the border, Rome has trouble defending, let alone raising more men to go on the offensive because they just don't have it. People are dying at too quick a rate. Lucius does not live to see this war with the Germans. He dies of, at the time, they call it food poisoning, but now we believe was probably the Antonine Plague. And Marcus himself will eventually succumb to the Antonine Plague. This devastates the empire. The key takeaway here is that the Germanic tribes are becoming stronger, and Rome is not equipped to deal with it anymore. The last 12 years of Marcus Aurelius' reign are dealing with these Germanic tribes and dealing with the plague. But while this is all happening, he also has a son. I mean, he has a lot of kids. Marcus Aurelius has 14 kids with his wife Faustina, which is ridiculous. But the important one here is this boy, right, Commodus, who is the not one of the 5 good emperors, which should kind of give you an idea of the direction Rome is about to start heading in. Commodus is a little sociopath. He's going to be on everyone's list of like bottom 5 worst Roman emperors of all time. He's an Ogura. And some of the blame must fall on Marcus. I mean, picking your own replacement, that's on you, right? But he does, for whatever reason, Commodus is bad. Commodus is not like his father in any way. He maybe is too young to rule, but honestly, I don't have a real answer for you, Aaron, in terms of like why he's so bad.
There's this interesting story that I read about Aurelius where he actually goes to a resort town to take care of some business, and everyone's kind of pressuring him to just chillax, relax, like have a drink. And Aurelius is completely sworn by his like stoic duty. He's like, no, I completely live by this. And I think that a good quote that kind of embodies this: do every act of your life as though it were the very last act of your life. And I think that Aurelius has this really important, like he takes time so seriously in being a good emperor that I think that he actually neglects probably something really important, and that's his son. Again, I wasn't there, I can't really say that, but you could imagine that even all of these philosophies, as I said in the beginning of the program, all of these philosophies are not created equal, and some might be better than others. And there's many virtues to Stoicism. One of the criticisms, though, of Stoicism might be if you are too duty bound, if you are too focused and too tunnel visioned in one direction, there's always something else that's going to be falling apart around you. And I think that if you are very successful in business, if you're very successful as being an emperor, well, something else is always going to be falling at the wayside. And I think in this case, that might be family.
It could be. I mean, Marcus, to his credit, tried at least a little. Commodus is about 10 years old during the Marcomannic Wars, which are the wars with the Germanic tribes, and he's present. He's present. So Marcus Aurelius at least has his son there to witness how to lead an army, how to lead men, how to do your thing. But it clearly either wasn't enough or it didn't work. The Danube is the Danube front is, I would say, probably no place for a child. But we didn't know. They didn't know. We know. They didn't know how bad it was actually going to be. It's funny because Commodus actually had an elder brother who died at a young age. And it's like, it's unfortunate. The world would be a very, very different place if that kid lived to adulthood.
Right. No, that's interesting. It's interesting that you say that Commodus spent his more formative years, basically in a war zone. I can only imagine what that would do to someone's psyche just to be seeing like these. And I think it's, there are grown men who go off to war and come back with PTSD. I could imagine what that could do to a 10-year-old. And maybe that's a time where Aurelius would have been like, he was probably thinking, well, my duty is to take my son and train him here on the front. And it's like, maybe that's a moment where it's like, you also have a duty as a father to kind of, you don't want to overly protect your son so he's useless and won't be able to rule one day. But I think there's also judgment calls that have to be made about like what, at what level. And I think that, Hadrian was really smart in the sense that he knew that, hey, Aurelius is too young right now to rule. Like that's silly. Let me go ahead and put this intermediary emperor so that when Aurelius is ready, he can rule. And I think that's the kind of stuff that Aurelius needs to be focused on. Like, hey, my 10-year-old, I love you, son. You're going to do awesome things, but you shouldn't really be here on the front with dad.
Oh yeah, I mean, Marcus and Commodus joint ruled when Commodus was maybe like 10 years old to like really try to get him to understand how to rule. He starts his solo reign when he's about 20 years old, which is a little young, right? And that's when things start to go off the rails. But he tried for the first 20, because Marcus wasn't there after 20 years, or after he was 20 years old, right? He dies of the Antonine Plague, but he was trying. We don't know how successful he was. I don't want to say that if Marcus had lived longer, it would have been better, because I don't know if that's the case. I don't want to say that it didn't matter if he lived longer, because Commodus is just like a born sociopath, because I don't know if that's the case. I just know that these are the events as they unfolded.
Yes, absolutely. And look, again, as I've said before, Aurelius is one of my favorite emperors. I love Stoicism as a philosophy on the whole. But I think one of the important takeaways is this idea of balance. And I think that if he had just taken a day off every now and then and just showed his son a little bit more lightheartedness, a little bit more fun. Like today, we're going to be playing our Roman catch or Roman baseball right now. I have no idea, whatever it is that they were doing. I think that develops character. Like character is not just developed in your duty, it's also developed in your leisure. And I think it's important to have both facets somewhat cultivated. And I say that strongly because it's important to take your duty strongly, but you also have to be a bit lighthearted with yourself at certain times. And I think that if people don't see that, if you don't kind of develop that as well, it can end up being quite a blind spot. I'm not saying you should be a drunken fool like Lucius, but you do have to know when to kind of like loosen the belt and unwind a bit.
Definitely. And another factor to consider is that, like, Marcus, the way he treated Commodus as a child, a young Marcus would have been okay with that. Marcus was a very unique individual. Maybe he thought, as a lot of us do erroneously, like, hey, if I can handle it, you can handle it too. The golden rule, as it were, is not as bulletproof as people make it out to be. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. The golden rule really should be treat others the way they would like to be treated.
Yes. No, I think that's an excellent point that you're making, is that sometimes we say to ourselves, and this is, and again, I think this is actually a bit egocentric in the sense that, well, if I could do that, why can't everyone else do that?
Oh,
And
absolutely.
it's like not everyone is built with the same hardware or software to be able to do the things that you're doing.
It's borderline toxic. It gives a pass to people who are either like don't care, who are either very nihilist or are very perfectionist, to just kind of throw their weight around, right? Like if you're really good at everything, then you get to be super critical of everyone because you're amazing, and following the rule of like treat others the way you'd want to be treated is like, well, I would want to be yelled at if I couldn't do something as simple as solve the theory of relativity. I mean, what kind of dummies are we dealing with here, right? And then at the same time, people who don't care about anything are like, I'm going to abuse this person because I wouldn't care if I was being abused in this way.
Yes, and to kind of leave us off, I'm going to end off here on one of Aurelius's quotes. And maybe he should have followed this one a little bit more with the way he raised his son. You always own the option of having no opinion. There is never any need to get worked up or to trouble your soul about things you can't control. These things are not asking to be judged by you. Leave them alone. All right, Brett, thank you so much for being on the show here today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
This concludes the 11th part in our series, Rome, the Decline of Democracy. I'm Aaron Azrod.